This webinar is the second in our new series called EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum, which brings to aim together the aviation community to discuss about aviation sustainability in a post-COVID era. But let me start by introducing myself. I'm Marilyn Bastin, the head of aviation sustainability at EUROCONTROL. And I really hope that you will enjoy this webinar as much as I enjoyed preparing it. I have the chance to have a wonderful panel this afternoon, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you Jonathan Wood, Vice President, Renewable Aviation in Neste, Sarolta Katona, the Head of Sustainability at Budapest Airport, Tim Johnson, Director at Aviation Environment Federation, and finally, Freek de Wit, Public Affairs Manager in DHL Aviation. You are maybe thinking, again, another webinar about aviation sustainability, or you are maybe thinking, does it make sense to speak about aviation sustainability? What is aviation sustainability? Last week, during our first webinar, Marc Ami from Airbus said that aviation offers irreplaceable benefits today and the promise of a sustainable transport tomorrow. Aviation ensures mobility, connectivity, provision of food and medical supplies. But in the same time, the expectations of the society are increasing. Climate change, noise, air quality, all these issues need to be tackled, addressed at both local and global level. But how to conciliate all these different challenges? How do we ride the wave of change on sustainability? One of the objectives of the EU Green Deal is to allow economic growth while reducing net EU carbon emission to zero by 2050, including a 90% reduction in transport emission compared with 1990. So the aviation sector has to decarbonize. But how could we do this? And especially now, in this time, during the COVID crisis, when the cash is missing, you are maybe wondering that it will be quite challenging and difficult. So we will try to address those questions with our panelists today. You will also learn that the decarbonization of the aviation has already started. In fact, it's happening now. So with our four panelists today, they will share 4 different dimensions of aviation sustainability. With Freek and Sarolta, we will understand better the challenges that airlines and airports are facing, the efforts they are putting in place to reduce the environmental impact of their operation, the changes in their strategy to become or to be an active player. With Jonathan, we will understand more the challenges related to the development for more sustainable aviation fuel. And finally, with Tim, we will discuss the societal expectation to build back better when the traffic is back. After sharing their view about aviation sustainability in a post-COVID era, I will open the floor to a question and answer session. Some of you have already sent some questions, and I would like to thank you for this. We will try to address them after the presentation of our panelists. But this session is your session. So we would really like to invite you to use the chat box to send your question, and we will try to address them later on with our panelists. Now, I'm sure you are impatient to listen to our guest. So I would like to introduce our first guest, Jonathan Wood from Neste. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Marilyn. Great to be here. Let me just pull up my slides. So hopefully that's working for you. Marilyn mentioned the challenge of sustainability, and I think it's important right up front to recognize that there are multiple pathways to delivering a more sustainable aviation industry for the future, be it new technology, new aircraft, new propulsion systems, improved operations. And what I would like to give you a quick insight on is where we're at and where we're heading in terms of the availability of sustainable aviation fuels. A hot topic. Societal pressure is certainly increasing the recognition of climate change and its implications, and indeed an awful lot of consultation taking place right now at governmental and at EU level on what the future frameworks to support sustainable aviation could look like. And I think it's important to recognize that despite the difficult times, it is still moving forward and must move forward. And here at Neste, I can speak from the point of view of being the largest renewable fuel supplier globally today, both of sustainable aviation fuel and indeed road transportation fuels. And we are already making great steps forward in terms of reducing the carbon emissions of our customers last year by some 10 million tons, and we envisage doubling that in the next decade, as well as also moving to carbon neutral operations ourselves. So I'll talk very quickly about the availability and sustainability. What, is it available? Is it sustainable? And then secondly, how policy can help overcome the challenge of affordability. So ASAP, availability, sustainability, affordability, and policy. So firstly, it is available and it is sustainable. We are already now able to supply sustainable aviation fuel made from recycled wastes and residues. It does deliver a net carbon reduction of 80 to 90% versus the fossil jet fuel alternative. So we're effectively recycling oils and fats and creating jet fuel, but as I say, not from fossil jet fuel. It is chemically and in terms of performance identical to fossil jet fuel, but indeed actually is cleaner in terms of having fewer particulate emissions. And it's available today as a drop-in solution, so you can use the existing airport infrastructure, the storage and pipelines, and obviously the existing aircraft. So in effect, this is something which can be mixed with existing fossil jet fuel today. And has been supplied now for a few years in a number of locations. Here I'm showing just what the map looks like for where Neste's product is being supplied today. It's fair to say that the Nordics were the leader in terms of bringing aviation, sustainable aviation fuel to airlines at various airports in Norway and Sweden. But it's now also being supplied in other countries around Europe, as well as in North America. And I hasten to add, this is a picture just of where Neste's sustainable aviation fuel is being supplied. There are other suppliers. We're supplying both commercial airlines as well as also general aviation. And we're very comfortable working with partners and distributors to ensure that this gets to market as quickly as possible and as high a volume as possible. So in essence, the shop is open. We're ready for business. The product is available and it is sustainable. And that is, I should hasten to add, certified by independent approved sustainability certification bodies, such as ISCC or RSB. So independently verified. But we need to invest more to grow the availability, and not just Neste, but other players as well. We welcome competition, we welcome additional production, because that will bring the momentum to the industry. And this is where I think policy is absolutely essential. This is a complicated map, but let me try and just pull out the key messages for you. So Europe and North America certainly have been leading in terms of policy support for sustainable aviation fuel, both from a demand side and well as from a supply side. In terms of demand, there are fundamentally two kinds of policy. One is incentives or bio tickets or bio credits, which help bridge the gap in price between sustainable aviation fuel and the fossil jet fuel traditional alternative. Bridging that price gap, making the incremental cost less, is obviously going to drive demand, and it has been doing so, especially on the west coast of North America, as well as indeed now in the Netherlands, the UK. So one policy mechanism is incentives to help lessen the price burden. The second is blending mandates or obligations. So countries here, in particular in the Nordics, Norway in dark blue, has moved last year forward with a blending mandate, albeit at a small level, now being followed in 2021 by Sweden at 1%. And indeed, many countries in the EU are now talking about both having incentives as well as also mandates to encourage the use of SAF, such as, for example, the Netherlands, France, Spain, and other countries. So what you see here is a combination of incentives and blending mandates, alongside then on the supply side, encouragement of new technologies to ensure that when we embark upon this journey, we can actually finish the journey and achieve the levels of SAF that are required, as per in the recent ATAG report, to achieve 50% or more in the coming years, and ultimately combined with new aircraft technology and improved operations to truly enable a carbon neutral aviation industry. We as Neste are moving forward on this pathway. We currently are supplying or have production capacity of around about 100,000 tons of SAF, and we envisage growing that significantly by 2023 and indeed beyond. And so just a little bit of an insight into what the beyond looks like. So we need to recognize that, yes, we have technologies available today that enable us to supply SAF up to maybe 10% of global demand. But we also recognize that using the recycled feedstocks and raw materials that we are, there may be limitations. So it's essential that we develop further the technology pathways. Here, in particular, municipal solid waste and other agricultural and forestry waste, as well as also, indeed, other conversion technologies, which both HEFA, the current technology, and these new technologies in blue on this chart in front of us could certainly supply well over half the fuel needs of the aviation industry. And then finally, and ultimately, as some of you may have heard about it, the so-called power to liquids production pathway, where hydrogen from renewable hydrogen is combined with carbon captured from the air to create a liquid fuel. This is, if you like, almost the ideal scenario, capturing carbon from emissions and from the air, but requires huge amounts of renewable power, electricity, and so currently is not yet technically feasible and certainly higher cost, but it's definitely got to be technology that we develop further. So in essence, what I'm saying here is we see a roadmap of different technologies that are required to bring SAF to market. So in summary, what I would say is, coming back to what I started with, it is available and it is sustainable in generating carbon reductions today. Policy is key to helping create the momentum and bridging some of the cost gaps versus the currently available fossil jet fuel. Investments are required, and that's where the policy can certainly help in terms of driving demand. And partnerships are key. We're very comfortable collaborating with whoever it needs to be in order to help grow this market. There's no one silver bullet here. We need to pursue the multiple options, and they are there, and we can see them. So let's get moving and deliver a sustainable aviation industry. Thank you very much, Marilyn.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this very fascinating presentation. It's good to hear that SAF are already available and we should get moving. So now I would like to get the floor to Sarolta.
So thank you for the opportunity, Marilyn. I'm very glad to participate at the webinar because I think it's very, very important to share the views with each other because despite of we are in the same sector, the best practices and the challenges are very different, and it's very useful to understand several approaches and understand each other. Therefore, before I start my presentation and start to talk about the challenges currently in the aviation sector from airport point of view, I would like to spend only just a minute to introduce our company, because I would like to put my speech into context. This slide shows that where we were in last year, and you can imagine that how the challenges are changed significantly compared to that. By 2019, we doubled our passenger figures compared to 2012, when we had 80 passengers. It was very difficult to develop our infrastructure as fast as the growth was. However, by now, we operate the airport only on a 5% level versus last year. This is very deeply below the European average. This is due to the border restrictions, and it's very, very significant change compared to last year, significant growth. And due to the current situation, the situation causes fundamental decision need, and despite of the low traffic, we have to think about the future. During the crisis, the previous directions, strategies, and goals are not valid anymore, and the owners have to rethink the targets. The typical first reaction is that we should spend only the must-have items, but the management has to understand that the sustainable development cannot be put into the nice-to-have category only, because an airport is a long-term investment, and to preserve the asset value, the operation should be managed in a sustainable way. Both management engagement level is very high, and they defined sustainability as one of the main pillars of the company. It was supported by an organizational change also, when the former environmental related team transformed into sustainability team. And the sustainability team was put under the financial directorate. So that was the key message. But of course, during the evaluation of the main areas where the airport has the highest effect, of course, the environmental related topics are the most significant ones. However, I think the management indication is very clear based on the actions. And the second big challenge is the capacity management. Because of during the past years, the airport passenger figures increased significantly, as I has already mentioned that. But currently, the focus is not on the capacity enhancement projects. However, instead of that, we have to make hard decisions. We have to make decisions about the human and the financial resources. And typically, an airport has a high proportion of the fixed cost, in midterm also. Therefore, the decisions are not so easy, and that will be established the future of the company. Therefore, it matters which type of the cost can remain. The investment into innovation and forward-looking projects will deliver the benefits for the airport. But if the airport decides of the hibernization of the airport and cut all of the sustainability-related costs, the restart will be very hard. And when the traffic will turn back, probably the key focus will be on the operation again. Therefore, we have to understand that we have now a very, very big advantage. And our very big advantage currently is the time. The time to prepare concepts and work out projects, because all of us probably knows that the longest period of a typical project is the preparation phase. And in terms of the third big general challenge of Budapest Airport is the stakeholder management and the cooperation. It was a big challenge in the past, and it is still, because the airport community is like a little city with a lot of employees, companies, outsourced activities, and also we have to care about the nearby residents, the municipalities, government authorities, and so on. And of course, the key customers are the airlines and the passenger via the airlines. but the lot of stakeholder with a lot of different type of has a lot of different type of prioritization. And despite of the conflict of interest, sometimes we still have to find the right balance. And because of the high dependence level, we can be successful only together. To sum it up, my key messages are, due to the COVID situation, the airport and the management faced with very new type of challenges, but the sustainable development goals still remained in the focus. Our three key messages would be, one of them is the commitment, which should happen on a high strategical level, the capacity, because in order to ensure the longer-term sustainability operation, this capacity management should be managed the proper way. And finally, the common goals and the cooperation between the sector can help to drive us on a path forward towards a better future. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Sarolta. It was a quite interesting presentation, and thank you for sharing your challenges today. So now I would like to give the floor to Tim, a director from Aviation Environment Federation. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, and a big hello to everyone that's joined today's event. It's good to be speaking to you. So for those of you that aren't aware of AEF, we're an environmental NGO. We're London-based. Our members are community groups, largely around the UK's airports and airfields. But we also work very closely with other international and national NGOs and are active at ICAO and in other fora. So hopefully the view I'll give you in the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes will sort of bring some of those things together. I think the obvious starting point is to largely agree with you, Marilyn, about the need for a green and resilient recovery. I think there's a lot of NGO support out there. And I think many of them have written to their respective governments calling for this and calling for this to be applied in particular to the aviation sector, so we can have a more sustainable aviation industry as it recovers from the pandemic. And I think some of the signs are quite encouraging. I think, not only are we seeing more opportunities for radical new technologies, and the debate around electrification or hydrogen fuel cells, whilst in its infancy, has certainly escalated throughout the COVID pandemic. It's not a debate that peaked and then went away. It's continued to build, and there's a lot more coverage of the technology challenges that we need to overcome to make that a reality. But there's also been no let up in some of the effort. So we've got big opportunities coming up in the next year or two, not only around the EU Green Deal, but obviously the UK hosting the COP in Glasgow next year, as well as some initiatives like the World Economic Forum's partnership with the Energy Transition Commission around sustainable aviation fuels, which is to be applauded, I think, in some ways for actually bringing stakeholders together that don't normally talk to each other. So not just the conventional industry participants, but the wider investment community, and really sort of tackling that question about not how to do it, but what's the business plan and how do you bring money and finance into this. So lots of good things, not least, I think we've also had a little bit of a reset. We've seen airlines retiring some of their older aircraft as a result of the pandemic. And this has always been about not just getting new technology in, but what do you do about the old stuff you want to get out of the fleet. So in a sense, that's been a positive. But I think Jonathan's already alluded to what I think is perhaps the major obstacle that we all face in trying to encourage a sort of sustainable growth post the pandemic. And that is really the lack of cash that the industry has. It's very clear that the initiatives that are going to deliver the biggest benefits come at a relatively higher price than burning kerosene and require substantial investment if we're talking about not just an electric aircraft, but what's the infrastructure that supports that? What does the airport of 2050 look like? in order to have battery technology and that draw up of power from the grid, you need a whole sort of infrastructure transition and investment that goes with it. And I think these are the real challenges. And I think if we sit back and look at it from a society point of view or an investor point of view, perhaps the biggest barrier is the lack of certainty about where we want to be in 2050. It's fair to say that it's really the industry that has set out its own 2050 vision, but perhaps the regulators are still trying to catch up a little bit. And I don't think that creates the necessary market certainty that investors need, because they see an industry that has no money, has little traffic at the moment. It may have the aspiration, but where's the business case to actually make that change at scale? And I think Jonathan highlighted what that challenge means for sustainable aviation fuels, but it's a great example. You know, typically they cost 2 to 3 times that of kerosene. Why, if you could buy an offset, would you invest in sustainable aviation fuels? Well, that's what the investor would say. Why would an airline be investing in sustainable aviation fuels? Therefore, I don't see where the demand's going to come from. So I think, you know, the biggest challenge that we have when we talk about recovery is to create the right framework. Before we start talking about the measures, we've got to create the right framework. We've got to increase accountability. We've got to increase certainty. And I think that means that we have to look very closely at 3 things. One is, at the moment, we do not have agreement on what an appropriate long-term goal is for aviation. I say the industry has its vision. ICAO is still working on a long-term goal for 2050. My own hunch is the way that's developing, it's much more of a bottom-up approach that's going to be, well, let's add together all the things we think may happen and set the bar at that level, as opposed to a scientifically derived approach of where we need to get to by 2050. But we certainly need to set that long-term certainty. And I don't think it's a question of international approach or domestic effort from states. It's going to be both. You know, the international effort is going to set the minimum level for the industry, the base level. And then states are going to be more ambitious, and they are going to seek domestic efforts to top that up. So that's one thing that's going to increase both investor and public confidence is having that sense of accountability that the industry has to deliver. The second one, I think, is probably we do not have strong carbon pricing at the moment. And I think with the changes to the CORSIA baseline, it's very unlikely that many airlines, in fact, any airlines, are going to have to surrender CORSIA permits in the coming years. So we're not having an international driver for the carbon price. Yes, we still have EU ETS. If as a result of the review that continues and is strengthened, but globally we don't have a strong carbon price. And I think it's probably fair to say that we don't have strong regulatory standards. The CO2 standard, for example, for aircraft manufacturers is something that stops backsliding. It's something that most aircraft in production already meet, but it's not pushing the boundaries of what manufacturers have to do. So there are 3 areas, I think, that when we talk about building back greener and more resilient, we have to address pricing, regulation, and long-term certainty. And then I really just wanted to touch a little bit just on noise. There have been quite a few of these sort of events recently about how the industry can build back in a more sustainable way. And we always talk about climate change, and that's probably right. But let's not forget that the issue that has, I suppose, challenged the industry for decades now has been the question of noise and noise in communities, or the noise that communities experience. And that's a really interesting problem when we think about what that may look like post-COVID, because for many communities over the last 6 months, they've had fewer aircraft, there's been less noise. Perhaps the longer this goes on, the more it's a reset for those communities. That will become the new norm. And as the industry grows back and we have more aircraft in the skies, I think some of those noise problems are going to come back to the fore, and potentially they're going to be more vocal about it. So I think as a little bit of a plea, when we talk about the sustainability challenge, yes, climate is quite rightly up near the top, but we also need to make sure that noise feature in that as well, the trade-offs between the two, some of the displacement effect. So some of those airlines that I mentioned have been retired early from passenger service, are obviously now making their way into the sort of dedicated freight market. Some of those are actually operating at night. So for some communities, they're seeing that as an impact. So you have to take a more rounded view, I think, as well, and think, yes, as you said at the beginning, it's three things really. I think it's noise, it's climate change, and we haven't talked about air quality, but I think air quality is one of those societal areas where there was a lot of pressure for regulatory change prior to the pandemic. And I'll probably pause there.
Thank you, Tim, for this great talk. I'm sure it will raise a lot of questions and reaction. So now I would like to give the floor to Freek from DHL Aviation. So Freek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Starting to share my presentation. Good afternoon all. Thank you for the invitation. We'll give a bit of a background on DHL, DPDHL Group, what we are and where we are going to. So we like to say that we are the most international company in the world because we are active in more than 220 countries, which is much more than Coca-Cola, for example. And we do this with 500,000 colleagues. We're a market leader in express logistics, in e-commerce, contract logistics, and of course, we're also active in Germany in the post and parcel service. I prepared a presentation together with Stephanie Echtman from our Brussels office. And as you can see from the title, we have our, let's say, own mission, Mission 2050, zero emissions. So with the subtitle, Go Green. So when Tim talked about the sense of accountability, we see ourselves as a market leader and we take our responsibility. We think we should lead this transition. If we look specifically on the perspective on aviation, what kind of challenges are we talking about? We have 260 dedicated aircraft, which are flying for us, performing 650 global flights a day. And if you look at the amounts of CO2 which are emitted from all of our operations, so not only aviation, you see clearly that 65% of it comes from air transportation. So you can imagine that this, looking to 2050, is one of our main challenges or main focus points. If we look at the specific subset of, I need to find the next slide. Okay. If we look at the specific subset of targets which we wanted to achieve by 2025, so we want to increase the carbon efficiency by 50% over 2007 levels. We want to certify 80% of our employees as Go Green specialists, so they all go looking and contribute to making sure we go green and we achieve our mission of zero emissions by 2050. We want to operate 70% of our own first and last mile services with zero emission solutions, and we offset all of our CO2 by joining partners and planting 1 million trees every year. So that's what we have set as a specific sub-targets by 2025. Turning a bit more to aviation specifically now, you can see that the most important projects which we have at this moment in time, you see on the top left. So we have a 1.1 billion fleet renewal, focusing mostly on the Boeing 777. So we are acquiring more than 20 of them at this moment in time. Why the 777? Because it has a superior fuel efficiency and range, and it has more than 18%. It's more than 18% more fuel efficient than most of the planes that it's replacing. We also work constantly on a fuel optimization program for all of our aircraft. Also, we're working, of course, together on ATM optimization. Also, ETS and CORSIA, we are, of course, involved. But we also look a bit wider than the purely aviation part. We're also looking for e-mobility for ground operations to see if we can have electrical high loaders And of course, we have some additional measures, for example, in the warehouses around the different airports to which we fly. Then we are increasingly focusing on sustainable aviation fuels. As I mentioned before, 65% of our CO2 emissions come from aviation. So we see this as a great one, let's say, I would not say the great equalizer, but one where we can and should make the most progress in the coming years. So there's different options. We have the, let's say, the first generation of biofuels. Now we are already moving to the advanced biofuels, which for us are let's say, much more sustainable than the first generation. And then we assume that we will also be looking to synthetic fuels in the future. The issues which we see there, indeed, as I already mentioned before, there's the price gap, the limited supply, and then the sustainability discussions around it. And long term, we're also looking at new propulsion technologies. What did we already do when it comes to sustainable aviation fuels, and how do we engage? There's a German and a global alliance of power fuels, which we joined and which we are actively contributing to. We also have a focus on synthetic or e-fuels, where we have a white paper which we have published on how do we see the progress on this. We also work together in the framework of the World Economic Forum on Clean Skies for Tomorrow, and then also the initiative on fueling flights. Coming to my last slide, and more specifically on where do we see the challenges for the policymakers, and there I come together a bit with what Tim and Jonathan were saying, and I think also what was brought forward by Budapest Airport. Looking at sustainable aviation fuels, there's a specific DG Move initiative on Refuel EU Aviation, where we see lots of points where we agree upon. We think we need a harmonized approach, and if possible at international level. There will of course always be a patchwork, but the more we can limit this, the better this will work. We also think that regulation should look at quota or obligation on suppliers and based on the greenhouse gases reduction. Ensure funding, especially in the beginning, to address the price gap. And also we are really looking for robust sustainability criteria, being advanced biofuels as a long-term solution. We are looking at synthetic fuels, so maybe work with a sub-mandate, but the first generation of biofuels for us were not sustainable enough, let me put it like that. And we're also looking at the book and claim system, like it's currently for green electricity. There's also some links to other EU policy issues. So the importance of air cargo should be recognized, especially in crisis situations like now with the COVID-19 crisis. Also, all measures taken should preserve the financial ability of operators to still invest in the fleet renewal and sustainable aviation fuels. We already talked a bit about the financial situation where the aviation sector is in. So we should find the right balance between making sure the sector can still invest. And then as a third point, all other relevant aviation activities and investments for us should be considered as well, as long as they help reducing the environmental footprint. Looking at e-mobility for airport operations and things like that. So that's the main points from my side. Thank you for your attention. And if you would like to be in contact with me or Stephanie, these are our contact details.
Thank you, Freek, for this amazing presentation. It's good to hear that concrete action are already taking place. So thank you for this great presentation. I propose that we start our question and answer session. I saw in the chat that we already received many questions, but maybe I propose that we start with one of the questions we have received in advance. But again, as this session is yours, if you have some specific question you would like to address to one of our panelists, please do so. Just explain to which panelist you would like to ask the question. and I will try to pick it up and to ask the panelists to answer to your question. So don't hesitate to send your question in the chat. But I propose that we start from one question that we have received in advance from Genter from Air Traffic Consulting. It's a kind of tricky question. It's not so easy. So what do we mean by sustainable aviation? How much aviation do we need? Is it sustainable to transport goods and people just because it's technically possible to do it? So maybe I would like to ask Tim to answer to this question, and afterwards maybe Freek as well. So Tim, do you have an opinion on this kind of high-level generic question about aviation sustainability?
Well, I think it's a reminder really that we shouldn't take it as a given, that there will always be a finite amount of aviation, and that we're necessarily always looking to grow aviation as much as we can. I think the climate change debate has reframed that entirely. I think it's how much aviation can a net zero world support, and then that throws the challenge then back to the industry. The answer would probably be, without the initiatives that we've just been discussing, not very much. But if we can actually use that to accelerate the rate of introduction of, I'd say, the radical new technologies and fuels, then I think on that basis, we can support aviation proportional to our ability to have sort of zero carbon technology. There's going to be a transition phase. But I think, it's one of those really big questions. But I think the main takeaway for me is that we just shouldn't assume that it's a finite resource, that actually it's something that we will increasingly be asked to justify. And as we transition down towards net zero, unless we have the answers, I think you will find increasing public pressure for maybe caps on airport expansion or caps on total numbers of flights at a particular location, justified by the climate change rationale. And I think we're beginning to see that already. There are some very early signs in the last year or two that climate change is playing a much bigger role in airport capacity decisions, and the public wants answers. So I think it's the thing that we always have to keep in mind.
Thank you. And Freek, maybe as a cargo airline, you would like to react on this?
Yes, I thank Gunther Martens for his question. He has quite a lot of experience in the sector, so he knows what he's talking about. So I think from a DHL perspective, of all the means of transportation we have, flying things is the most expensive. So if we can avoid it, we do avoid it. But I do agree on the fact that we as a sector, we should earn, let's say, our license to operate. So in that sense, I think it's more of a discussion, a societal discussion, which we need to have. But I think one of the questions was also a bit around, okay, but if railway grows, will aviation not suffer? I think there's a right balance to be found between the two sectors, because I think they're both complementary in what they offer. They both transport passengers and goods, but they have clearly distinct advantages when it comes to longer distances, shorter distances, and all these aspects.
Okay, thank you. I propose that we switch to another question, maybe. I see a question from Bram Peerlings from NLR, a question to Jonathan Wood. So the question is about, did I correctly hear that currently sustainable aviation fuel supplied by Neste allows for 80 to 90% reduction life cycle CO2? Would you expect those numbers can grow in the next year's decade by improving production efficiency? So Jonathan, could you answer to this? Understood, yeah.
Yeah, so firstly, that is correct. The sustainable aviation fuels that are now being made available from waste products that would otherwise be thrown away and not reused and recycled is 80 to 90%. In fact, really, the reason why it's not 100% is the production process to treat and convert those waste products is what is costing us, if you like, 10 to 20% of the carbon saving versus fossil jet fuel. And certainly we would hope to improve that over time. I mean, just the announcement this week where we've supplied sustainable aviation fuel to Japan, that's delivering actually a 90% saving in carbon versus fossil jet fuel. And indeed, with the future technologies, which are not yet technically proven and commercially scaled, but you know, you've got to believe that hydrogen is going to role in the future, and in the production of power to liquid type of e-fuels, as was mentioned earlier. There, indeed, if you're capturing the carbon from the air and using renewable energy, then you could see a world where you're getting closer to 100% carbon saving versus fossil jet fuel. I think there's always going to be some carbon emissions associated with bringing it to market, but certainly we would look to improve that. I don't see a world where we would want to compromise on this going forward.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I have another question for you, by the way, from Antonio Lazarowski. So does the current fuel solution you provide with recycled oils and fats requires an implementation of a technical upgrade of the jet engine of an aircraft, or no modification is needed?
That's a simple question. No modification needed, and that's why the solution that's available today is so attractive and so important. I believe that we move forward on. It's not to say that new aircraft and indeed new aircraft propulsion technologies like including hydrogen that was talked about in last week's webinar don't have a role to play, but this is one that we can deploy immediately.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. Thank you, Jonathan. I have another question maybe for Sarolta. Coming from Ansgar Sickert, so I hope I pronounce it correctly, the name. How long would it take for an airport to recoup a major investment in sustainable energy production?
Sorry, I cannot hear the middle of the question, so how long?
How long would it take for an airport to recoup a major investment in sustainable energy production?
Mm-hmm. Of course, it depends on the current infrastructure and the probable future infrastructure and the development costs. So this depends on many factors, and of course, in terms of sustainable and higher investments, Budapest Airport, like many airports, prepares a so-called business case and calculate relevant IRR also. But of course, if an airport cares about the sustainability, a lower IRR rate is enough to cover the investment. But typically, the renewable energy is a returnable one, because in case of if we are talking about, for example, the solar city or solar panels, and by for example the geothermal energy, it can cover a lot of consumption of an airport, because as I mentioned, that the airport is like a little city and the main CO2 emission is based on the electricity and the gas consumption. Therefore, it's very worth to do that kind of investment.
Thank you. Sarolta, I have another question from you, coming from Suwana from Bangkok Aviation Fuel Services Public Company Limited. So how is the plan for SAF supply in pipeline to airport? Do you have something to say about this?
Yes, it's a very hard topic, because it's the SAF would require a high investment cost typically, and a very strong cooperation with other partners, because the airport initiative is not enough to do the investment, because we need the airline and the demand, the valid demand also. And at Budapest Airport, we have the pipeline only for kerosene. And I think the first step is not to establish a pipeline for the SAF, because first of all, we have to have the valid demand. And fortunately, we have a train and loading station. Therefore, in midterm, if we will do some trial, we will be able to deliver staff on an alternative way, which is an advantage from Budapest Airport view. But for a pipeline connection, I guess a lot of demand is necessary to prepare because of the high investment cost.
Okay, thank you, Sarolta. Maybe, Jonathan, you can complement on this?
Yes, I would just say that fundamentally, SAF can be delivered by pipelines. Sustainable aviation fuel can be delivered by dedicated jet fuel pipelines to any airport, since it is approved as a jet fuel. It can be commingled. So yes, there may be requirements to track the inputs so that we know as a whole how much SAF is being delivered in a given country or at a given airport. But yes, it can be used in any dedicated jet fuel pipeline. And the same goes for storage. Once it's at the airport, it can be commingled with existing fossil jet fuel. At least that's the so far approved sustainable aviation fuel product types. There are 7 pathways approved by the global certification body, ASTM, and all of those can be commingled. In order to meet the required quality, there is a blending process that has to happen beforehand. But once it's approved as sustainable aviation jet fuel, it can be used in any of the existing dedicated infrastructure.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question for Tim now, coming from Patrick Edmond. Since Corsia's ambition is so incredibly low, does it bring any benefits at all, or is it simply an obstacle for true sustainability progress? So a quite a sensitive question here. So Tim, it's the perfect question for you.
So I think it depends on who's asking the question. I mean, I think in terms of does it meet and contribute to the sort of ambition that we talk about in Europe, then I would have to agree, and I think most NGOs would agree that the way it is currently designed, it has both a very weak carbon price and actually a very weak target. So you would tend to agree. But one of the benefits, one of the reasons why some of the NGOs invested so much time in the ICAO process to make it happen, is if you look at it globally, there are many places in the world that actually benefit from actually having to record and report emissions on a regular basis and to start some price signal, because they don't have the same domestic drivers. And for that point of view, it was a good thing to happen at a global level. But the bottom line, bringing those two things together, is it something we should be encouraging or sort of dismissing? I think it's obviously here to stay, and it's here till 2035. That's when Corsia ends. And hopefully through the review process, which happens every 3 years, we can tackle some of its weaknesses, like can we make it tougher? Can we ask it to do more? But the challenge to the industry goes back to the one that I referred to in my presentation, that if you're looking for a business case to invest in sector reductions, is the availability of relatively cheap offsets a distraction? Because when there isn't much cash about, if you can reach your climate targets and your commitments by way of offsetting, does it delay the date by which we need to be making the investment to support the in-sector reductions? And I think that is the real risk and challenge. Whatever you think of Corsia, that's the real thing that I think challenges the industry. Is it actually going to inhibit action at the pace at which we require it?
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Freek, I have maybe a question for you from Martin Gillick. So competitive advantage is the main driver for airlines and all businesses in defining their business strategy. So why will airlines invest in this area if their bottom line is not improved by it? I don't know if you want.
Thank you for the question. Well, competitive advantage, it always revolves around the customer. So for us, our customers more and more are asking of us that we get our license to operate by being in line with what the society expects of us. So more and more customers will not want to use an airline anymore, which is not working on sustainable aviation fuels, on fleet renewal, on looking to become carbon neutral, and basically to be in line with the Paris agreements. So that's a very basic answer, but it's really the one driving us forward. I think other airlines are going in this direction as well, but indeed, sometimes not always visible yet, I think, for the outside world.
I have another question from you, from Romain Desmetres. How do you foresee the negative impact on sustainability of aviation that the current underfinancing of the ATM will have?
That's a good one, or let's say a difficult one, since there was a huge, or there is a huge modernization effort ongoing in air traffic management, with a few key projects which would help deliver much benefits. At this moment in time, I think there's a renewed effort on CES2+. So I think it will be part of this to see how the financing of this package, and also let's say the continuation of the modernization of air traffic management in Europe will continue. So I'm looking there, because with the reduced number of flights, it's the remaining airlines who should cover all the costs. I think this will be a difficult one.
Thank you, Freek. I see another question from Teresa Di Lalo about drones. So maybe I will address this topic to Sarolta. If they are not off topic, drone operation will be increasingly present in airspace. What does the future hold for us in terms of overall sustainability? Could, for example, bring benefits to reduce the environmental effect of human activities, such as aerial work and delivery. So Sarolta, maybe as an airport, because I know that some operation could be replaced by drones. Do you want to react on this question? Do you see some improvements thanks to drones to aviation sustainability?
It's a difficult question, because currently, as you are aware from the news, we have more difficulties with the drones and not advantages from that. So it's very important, because the first pillar should be the aviation safety and security. And if we will find a proper solution to apply drones and to protect them from external effects, it can work in the future. But my opinion is, and my personal opinion is, that it's a midterm or long-term development and not short-term ones, because currently a lot of airports cannot solve the protection from the drones. So that's the issue.
Thank you, Sarolta. I have another question now from Francisco Hoyas, and for all panelists, but I think that maybe Jonathan is the best one to answer. But anyway, what are the realistic targets for 2025 and 2030 regarding the use of SAF? So before asking also to Freek, I can maybe start with Jonathan. So Jonathan, do you want to comment?
So the lead time on building of new SAF production capacity is quite significant, as well as indeed the investment costs, as mentioned earlier. So you're probably looking at 5 years from design and planning permission through to building and commencing production. So the lead time for capacity coming on stream is significant. However, we can already see, based off announcements made, a significant amount of capacity coming on stream from new plants, as well as from conversion of old refineries to renewable feedstocks and technology. So if you look at the recently announced Clean Skies for Tomorrow recommendations and report and analysis around production capacity and feedstock availability, that would tell you that a 5% of total aviation fuel demand could be a reasonable target in 2025 and 10% in 2030. This was an analysis done for Europe, but I think fundamentally the same kind of objectives could hold globally. And we're confident that the feedstock is available to enable that to happen. It's worth noting some countries are talking about even higher share of SAF in 2025, 2030. The Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Norway, have talked about 27% emission reduction, or roughly speaking 30% by volume. So there are some countries who are already talking about a more ambitious level, but certainly those are the kinds of figures that are achievable based off the analysis that's been done around the deliverability of this SAF technology, and then it really should thereafter ramp up as the other production pathways come on stream. Okay,
thank you, Jonathan. And Freek, would you like to react on this 5% for 2025 and 10% for 2030 as an airline? Do you see it as a possible target?
It's difficult to say from our side. So I think his answer was quite complete. Maybe just to put one thing in perspective. So Jonathan was mentioning earlier that if I not mistaken, he's producing 100,000 tons for 2019. At our biggest hub in Leipzig, we use 5 times that on yearly basis already now. So on one of our hubs, okay, it's our biggest one, but so still quite some production capacity to scale up.
Thank you, Freek. Again, I have another question from Jonathan, from Riccardo Massaci. Apparently, SAF is really in the middle of all attention, but it's good to hear because it's already there today. So if this fuel is already available, does it mean that it is competitive in terms of price? Would it also mean that it might be potentially cheaper than oil-based jet fuel if economies of scale kick in? So, Jonathan?
So, as I mentioned earlier, it is higher cost than fossil jet fuel, and indeed right now fossil jet fuel is certainly a lower cost than it has been in recent years. So you're looking at probably a higher cost differential than you might have been a year ago. Certainly, as production comes on stream and we get larger scale plants and more experience, we will see production costs trending down over time. But I would want to also be honest and straight with everybody. Sustainable aviation fuel does cost significantly more than fossil jet fuel does today, and probably will in the future as well. And that's why I think that policies to help favor sustainable aviation fuel, both at a government level, but also maybe even at an airport level, are going to be key to also helping drive the demand and momentum towards sustainable aviation fuel.
Thank you, Jonathan. And maybe, Freek, in the same line, how is the aviation industry meant to cope with higher cost of SAF when it's struggling for survival?
Well, I think every crisis is an opportunity, or at least it's a saying we have within DHL as well. So I think the level of activity is much lower in the sector than it is normally. So it also gives an opportunity operationally to ramp up in a slower pace. So I think this is not talking about the financial part. This is what it is. But I think if we look operationally to gradually feed it in. Literally into what is happening, I think the lower volume of operations provides an opportunity to do this, and also, to have the preparation. I think, as Sarolta already said, preparation is very important.
Thank you, Freek. I have another question from Celia Rodriguez. What could be an example of a regulatory measure that would help the industry recover from this terrible pandemic and at the same time become more sustainable? So maybe I could start with Tim as an NGO. Maybe you have some ideas about what kind of measure could help the industry and also to be more sustainable.
Well, I think you could link this question with the last question, actually, because if the question is how will airlines with no money make this investment, I think the answer is you mandate it, and Jonathan touched about this on one of his policy measures. Ultimately, it's going to be very hard, however painful it may be, it's going to be very hard to implement these measures without some cost through to the consumer. And I think that's not going to be something that shareholders will want to see unless governments drive it. But at a time when many industries are going to their government for financial help to get through the pandemic, whether that's just help to survive and help to keep employees on board, I think it is an opportunity to think, okay, but in the longer term, where as you start to grow back, then and traffic returns, these are the conditions that we want you to say. And so I think having things like mandates on SAF is a good example of driving change, but at the same time ensuring that the industry is, so I used the phrase accountability earlier, but is held to account to deliver on that. The reason I pause slightly is I think whilst we're on the topic of mandates for SAF, I wouldn't want it to go without sort of giving an NGO perspective on this. NGOs generally are very supportive of some types of SAF, in particular the potential for e-fuels in the long term, especially if you use green hydrogen rather than blue hydrogen, for example. And there are some sort of biofuel feedstocks that NGOs also support, but we think they're probably going to be available in very small quantities. So the idea of a mandate is potentially a double-edged sword. It creates the right incentives, but at the same time, there's a danger that if we can't supply it through genuinely sustainable SAF, then you start to create a market for things that we don't necessarily want to be promoting. So it comes with a slight note of caution, but I think a SAF mandate in general would be an example that meets the question.
Thank you, Tim. I have a quite provocative question now from Robin de Rancy. I suppose an airline like DHL has negotiated fuel prices at many airports around the world. Do you perform fuel tankering? That is loading more fuel than you need to avoid refueling at the destination airport and save money. So, Freek, do you want to react on this question?
I will not go into detail, but of course, I mentioned our flight optimization program. So one topic could be, okay, do we load more fuel than we need? But then you need to carry it with you as well. So if you know that some of the bigger airplanes can carry up to 150,000 tons of fuel, it means if you only need 50, that your gross weight of your plane is much higher. So I think most of the time the fuel prices are not that different that it makes sense to do this.
Okay, thank you, Freek. Last week, Michiel van Dorst, the CEO of LVNL, proposed 3 KPI for monitoring a sustainable future: reduction of emission, noise, and capacity. Do you agree, or do you think that other dimensions should be monitored? Sarolta, do you want to comment on this from an airport perspective? Do you think it's enough to look to emission, noise, and capacity?
Yes, thank you. It's very, very hard to define the right KPIs, but typically an airport measures a lot of things during its operation, the consumption of the energy and gas and fuel and so on. But definitely the CO2 emission is a very, very good KPI to measure, because as airport, we have a so-called standard airport carbon accreditation. Therefore, we have the right method how to calculate it, and it's comparable with other airports. Therefore, of course, it's a benefit to measure it because we have the comparison. Currently, Budapest Airport is an ACAS 3+ level. Therefore, I fully agree with that. Regarding noise, it's very critical from airport perspective, because we have to care about and think about the residents and the nearby municipalities. And noise is a general problem for an airport. And it's very important to measure it and to present it, to be very transparent. For example, Budapest Airport has 6 fixed and 1 mobile location to monitor noise, and we have a public surface. Therefore, the resident is able to monitor the noise level on real time. If we can see on a sky airline or an aircraft, we can monitor the noise effect nearby the airport via the monitoring stations. So I think it's very, very important KPI. And we have very wide range of KPI systems. Therefore, of course, we have to highlight something, but we can measure many, many things. I agree with that also.
Sarolta, very quickly, because we have only 1 minute left before the wrap-up. Tim, maybe on your side as an NGO, do you think that emission, noise and capacity are the good criteria?
I do. I think emissions covers air quality and the climate challenge that we discussed. Noise, as I referenced, I think is a really important parameter. We shouldn't lose sight of that. But the capacity part of this is the interesting part. And maybe if you go back some years now to sort of a report that the economist Lord Stern made on climate change generally, he talked about the dangers of locking into like carbon intensive infrastructure, and that's what airports could be viewed as in many ways. So you know, you have to think ultimately this is a combination of the individual technology on a flight or in the ATM system. But it's also about the capacity that exists not just on the air but on the ground, and I think that has to be part of the equation. So you look at that with a view to noise, and you look at that with a view to emissions, and you come back to that question we had right at the beginning, which is, you know, are there finite limits to this? And until we have the technological answers, the answer is probably yes. Yes, there are.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's time to wrap up this session now. And just for your information, we were between 300 and 400 participants today. And I really thank you for your very active contribution, because we received many, many questions. So I'm really sorry for the question that have not been addressed. Maybe it will be for another panel. So we had quite interesting and sometimes very challenging question and discussion. Our 4 speakers have opened the debate on how aviation can be sustainable in a post-COVID era. The decarbonization of the aviation has already started. It's not for 2035 or not only for 2050, it's already happening now. With Jonathan, we learned that sustainable aviation fuel are already available now, but we should get moving. Developing the market is essential, as it will contribute to reduce the cost. And we learn about 2 different measures that could be taken. Either we could incentivize the use of SAF, or we could impose a blending mandate. So it's 2 ways to manage it. With Sarolta, the strategic and financial dimension of aviation sustainability has also been discussed. The need to develop a joint and collaborative approach to meet the sustainability challenge has been developed as well. With Tim, we discussed the difficult challenges of a traffic recovery after quiet skies, the need to answer to all the expectations from the society to build back better. And finally, with Freek, we learn more about the DHL Go Green program and their zero net ambition by 2050. We heard that very concrete measures are already taking place. Replacement of all aircraft by new and more efficient aircraft, the fuel optimization of the operation. So I hope that this webinar gave you some insight about aviation sustainability, the challenges and the path to aviation decarbonization. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but together we can make it. We here in EUROCONTROL believe it's our role to facilitate this discussion. So to this end, we have also organized 2 more seminars before Christmas. The next one will take place the 9th of November, and it will be about the digitalization of the European sky. You will find more details on our website. Finally, I would like to thank you very much, our 4 speakers, for their great contribution today, and the viewer for their active participation. Stay safe and see you next time. Thank you.